Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a different audience to me. I'm used to speaking in groups of sort of bankers and all sorts of organisations, but not generally educated architects and others. So slightly intimidated by the knowledge in the room around this space. But my focus is really going to be on the financing side of retrofit. I work for a company called Snugg. We have built, I'll show you a link later so you can see for yourself. I'm not going to talk about the product, but we live in this, we sort of work in this space of trying to help people actually understand what they need to do for their homes, and then work out what grants are available and bank financing options to actually finance that improvement in parallel with finding someone to actually do the work. So that's the kind of the solution that we offer. Just a bit of a context. The landscape on the left there, I probably don't need to explain to the people in this room. You'd be familiar with the fact that heating of residential homes is a significant contributor to the UK's carbon emissions. Various different numbers. We've gone with 21%. I've seen various different versions of that number. And then the chart on the right you might also be familiar with. This is from the Climate Change Committee, which said a few years ago now that the cost of retrofitting the UK's homes to the level that we need them to be to achieve net zero by 2050 is approximately £250 billion. I've seen estimates of double that and slightly less than that, but again, that's the number that we typically go with. And that's going to be a huge challenge. It's obvious, certainly under the current government, but even under future UK governments and obviously separate arrangements in Scotland, it's obvious that grants aren't going to be put in place to finance this kind of transition. There is going to be a huge dependence on individuals paying for these improvements for themselves, but the reality being that not everybody has money kicking around for this sort of thing when there are other priorities, other things people want to do with their spare cash, and therefore financial services have a huge role to play in terms of financing these improvements. The good news is that there are various obligations, which I'll talk to you in a second about, in terms of why banks are increasingly being encouraged, obliged, incentivized to actually lend money in this space and finance some of these transitions. Just to give you a sort of a positive feeling here, we think it is possible to actually make this sort of hang together economically. Now, just a bit of a kind of caveat, all the numbers on here are entirely made up, they're indicative, illustrative to sort of help you get the picture. But the way we talk about this is that the case for an individual retrofitting their home is slowly moving from what was a no-hoper into what we call a no-brainer. So in the no-hoper scenario, if you take this back certainly a couple of years ago, say that somebody had sort of needed to spend £10,000 improving their property, the only real driver of them doing that might be £3,000 worth of energy savings over a 10-year period, say, and therefore the net cost is £7,000. Nobody did it, kind of thing. What we're moving towards is a number of different factors that start to make that that business case a huge amount better. So I was talking to a few guys just in the room here earlier about the sort of place-based retrofit, the economies of scale, as people start to do this more and more, especially if there are lots of people in the same area making these changes, the actual cost of making the changes come down. I've said 1,000, it could be significantly more, 30, 40%. I've heard for sort of, aggregating demand. So that comes down. Grants, so, I don't know, hands up if you're aware the Great British Insulation Scheme got announced this week. Bit of a damp squib. I think I saw it in The Guardian and not very little place. I'll talk about grants in a second. But grants are just about starting to become a little bit more widespread, not as much as we'd like, but they are starting to emerge. Property value is a huge thing. So people don't generally think that adding efficiency measures to their home will drive the value of their property, but it is possible. And there are hundreds of, let's say dozens of papers out there that actually talk about the impact, and that's probably the single biggest impact financially on your house by making these changes. It's the improvement in value, particularly for things like visible things like solar panels. Heat pumps are seen to heat-proof your property as well, so they're increasingly adding value. Fuel savings, obviously fuel prices have gone up, so the amount you save by making your home more efficient has pretty much doubled, if not more, over the years. Bank products are emerging. I'll talk about those in a second, which mean you can pay less interest on a mortgage or any loan that you take. And then finally, carbon credits, something that certainly we're looking very closely at. So the fact that you can actually convert the reduced carbon emissions from heating your property into credits. Companies like Snugg and others can aggregate up those credits and then sell those to willing buyers and pass the value of those credits back to the individual homeowner. So another incentive for an individual to make those changes. And as I say, turning the business case from a no-hoper into a no-brainer. I was asked to talk about grants, and I was like, oh goodness, how do I talk about grants? We're trying to demystify all of this, but what I've presented to you here is it's probably not 100% accurate because it's very difficult to understand exactly what grants are available to what people in which part of the country, what the means testing is. I'm glad everyone's taken a picture of this actually because it made it worth the while. Which improvements are covered and what are the requirements of the property. So you'll see there, it basically varies, whether you're in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, it varies. Each of those has different income or benefits or age eligibility checks. Each of them covers a different set of improvements. Obviously, GBIS is focused on insulation, but there are existing schemes. And to be fair, in Scotland, the Home Energy Scotland scheme is probably the best in the country by some way in terms of the breadth of what it covers and the sort of the relative lack of means testing for doing that sort of thing, but covers pretty much everything. And then property requirements, the EPC level you're at. The new one for GBIS is the council tax band, so anyone, certainly in Scotland, in council tax bands A to E, has a good chance of getting their insulation paid for now, if you can be bothered to go through the process, which is another challenge. So yeah, very complex. I'm not going to go through all of them, but hopefully this paints a useful picture of the complexity that's there. And certainly there are sort of eligibility checkers emerging. There's one on, as part of the Great British Insulation Scheme announcement, DESNZ announced an eligibility checker on the gov.uk website now, which helps people understand what grants they qualify for, but it doesn't cover all of these grants, so it's still only part of the picture. But things are emerging. We're doing something ourselves in this space, and a lot of the banks that we're working with are very interested to help their customers in this space. Why are banks interested in this? Well, there are a number of different reasons, probably not all on here, but there are a myriad of different reporting requirements increasingly falling on banks to show that they are reducing their carbon emissions. You've probably heard of the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 type structure that exists now. So not just the emissions in their own buildings and bank branches, etc., but also emissions from the companies that they lend to. And the interesting thing from our perspective is the people that they lend to through mortgages and the emissions that come from those houses are increasingly part of the spectrum here. So they need to reduce those emissions. Various targets. Unfortunately, one of the things that's been mooted is obliging banks to get an average EPC rating of C for their mortgage portfolio, which, as most of us probably know, EPC ratings aren't a great measure of carbon emissions, and don't encourage heat pump adoption, etc., etc. So not ideal. But there are those are the drivers that reputationally banks want to be seen to be doing the right thing. There's a credit risk here, so if you reduce someone's energy bills, they're more able to afford their debts and afford their interest payments. So that's another bonus for doing this. There's a portfolio risk that if they're homeowners, and particularly landlords who might face some regulation in this space, don't actually improve the efficiency of their properties, then they become less valuable, and that's something that makes the value of their property portfolios quite volatile. And then finally, and this in all the banks that we speak to, this is probably the least priority, is there is a lending opportunity. So if somebody wants to borrow £20,000 to do up their property, they can actually add another £20,000 to their mortgage, for example, to finance this. And on that note, there are a variety of different rewards now emerging. If you look down the right-hand side of the slide, a number of the banks, so I've got a few logos at the bottom, but Lloyds, Barclays in particular, are offering free money for doing this sort of stuff to their customers. Surprisingly low uptake by all accounts, considering it's free money. And there are a raft of financial products emerging, traditional kind of product finance, so especially on solar panels where you can just pay over a 10-year period. And actually, the sort of net cost per month can be pretty much zero, if not positive, by doing that. Personal loans, green borrowing, so obviously additional borrowing, but greenified products where they're basically giving preferential rates for people that are using this money to do green improvements. And then equity release is something that certainly interests us because there is a demographic of people over 55 wanting to settle down into their final home and want to be cozier. No, it's not just energy bills in their case, it could also be we want a more comfortable home. So lots of innovation in those products. There is actually a £24 million DESNZ fund that's being worked through at the moment. We're part of that, which is to encourage green finance innovation, and some of these products are emerging from that work. So there is some government support actually sort of to stimulate some of this innovation. A couple of new products. Product-linked finance isn't available yet, but that's this idea that a mortgage goes with a property rather than an individual. So if somebody moves, the payments on that mortgage continue to be paid by the homeowner, probably through their utility bills. And then finally, heat as a service, a slightly more established kind of proposition that a utility firm, for instance, might take on the responsibility of heating someone's home for a fixed amount, but actually take the risk of the energy price going up and down over time. So quite an interesting innovation. And then finally, institutional finance for place-based retrofit. So this is aggregating place-based properties, 500,000 properties in one place, and saying, well, let's retrofit that as a project. And then investment banks, large commercial arms of the retail banks are looking at actually financing that as one big sort of package rather than dealing with each individual. Different ways of doing that. A friend of mine from university called Rufus Grantham, we were just talking about actually. He's a bit of a thought leader in how that could work. I'm just going to leave you with this slide. If you do want to have a look at the product, I'm not pushing the product at all, but if you are interested, there's a QR code there. You can scan that and have a go. Thank you very much.
I'm from Energy Action Scotland, the national fuel poverty charity, so a little bit of a change of tone here, I suspect. And usually when I speak, I'm introducing what fuel poverty is, but because of what everybody has been through the past year, I suspect that nobody is a stranger to the notion that a great many households are struggling to pay energy, but beyond that, hundreds of thousands of households are unable to afford an adequate level of energy use in the home. So we've been campaigning for exactly 40 years against fuel poverty, and we campaign and shape policy and services to tackle unaffordable energy, inefficient, poor quality homes, levels of income and support, and to provide better education for advice and support for staff to support people and help them live in comfort without the stress and the threat to health and well-being that can arise from cold, damp homes. In 2019, almost 1 in 4 households in Scotland were in fuel poverty. That's over 600,000 households, and we estimate that as energy costs and inflation have risen and the incomes have fallen, that more than 100,000 households will now have joined those enduring fuel poverty, its effects and its consequences. While the debate expands, we remain focused on solutions and solutions and policy to end fuel poverty. So we're not moving into the other areas that complement ours, but simply to remain laser focused on something which has existed for so long and frankly hasn't seen a great decrease. So more than 1 in 3 households in Scotland are now worried about their energy costs, and at a time when these worries, it would be fair to say, are not troubling the shareholders of our energy companies. So I'm going to look at fuel poverty more from a stakeholder perspective, because with the best will and skill set in the world, there isn't one solution to this. There we are. We're often presented with a wry line of questioning about fuel poverty along the lines of, well, isn't everything just poverty, furniture poverty, period poverty? But no, it isn't the same, because it can't simply be solved by adding more money for most of the households. The fundamental fuel poverty drivers of fuel poverty are high fuel costs, high energy costs, not something that's technically easily influenced since energy markets remain a reserved matter. But Scotland has a brief and ultimately pointless interest in a state energy company, and the domestic market is dominated by private companies with no real option for consumer choice right now. So it does make it important that we use energy as effectively and efficiently as possible. which is the second driver, and that's energy use within the home. Low incomes, people in fuel poverty need not be in income poverty, and due to the rise of utility prices, overlap between fuel poverty and income poverty is less strong than it's been in the past. Policies to address income poverty now have less of a proportional impact on fuel poverty, though we're already in September, and such policies mitigating the struggle that's going to be so real for so many hundreds of thousands of families this winter are not yet in place. And that's a worry, given that we can see or can perceive the change in temperature just in the past week. And as to energy inefficient homes, some statistics from our context for you. 88% of fuel poor households live in homes with a SAP rating of less than 50. 50% of the fuel poor live in hard to treat homes. 43% of homes in Scotland are classed as hard to treat, so they're either off the gas grid or in terms of exposure, construction, and so on. And another issue is under occupancy, which accounts for 36% of the housing stock, and by 2029, single people households will expect to be 39%. And typically single person households heat fewer rooms in the home, which lowers the overall temperature of the house. Fuel poverty is also influenced by factors such as heating health-related health needs. If you're chronically sick and at home all day, then you're required to heat your home to a higher degree of thermal comfort for longer. And in terms of the wider ramifications of cold, damp homes on services, well, for every degree that the temperature falls below 5 degrees centigrade, so for every degree for 5 centigrade, there'll be a 37% increase of people attending GP, older people attending GP for respiratory illness. And if you put that in the context of the recruitment crisis for GP, particularly in remote and rural areas, that's really worrying in terms of the pressures on the NHS. Thank you. So of people living in fuel poverty, 36% are older people, 38% in the social rented sector, 30% owned outright. 57% of the houses are detached or semi-detached. 58% of homes are built between 1919 and 1982. The temperature regime is knowingly higher for those most likely to be affected by the adverse outcomes of living in cold, damp homes. And for these households, the other room's temperature in the heating regime needs to be increased from 18 to 20 degrees, while a living room temperature is maintained at 23 degrees. No extra help is being provided to these households despite this stated additional need. And it's worthwhile noting that as NHS Scotland policies change to help people live at home and be treated locally and in their communities to manage their health, that no financial assistance is provided to these households with essential medical equipment that can include ventilators, 24-hour motorised beds, dialysis machines, and not to mention more basic health needs like the need to refrigerate medicines and so on. In terms of the characteristics of fuel poverty, 65%, it uses 65% more fuel to heat a home in Braemar, 61% more for a home in Stornoway, 56% more in Aberdeen than it does for a home in Bristol. And who's more likely to be fuel poor? Single pensioners, 58%, two pensioner households, 44%, single adult households, 41%, and single parents, 33%. Add in a colder winter with real and significant drops in temperature for sustained periods, and there's real cause for concern there. And the number, as we see the number of households in fuel poverty escalate, realistically, we're looking at an increase in the number of excess winter deaths, which in any standard year is 6 people per day in winter in Scotland, which is a lot of people. If that was a road, I'd imagine that we'd be seeing a priority in government for investment, but we don't, and it will be more than 6. It doesn't necessarily correlate with the increase in energy prices, but we're going to see more deaths, unfortunately. This is the year-upon-year levels of fuel poverty in Scotland, and I wish we could add a third section actually to show us how many people have had to self-disconnect and for how long, because energy companies do actually have that information and unfortunately don't share it. But perhaps this would help us understand and anticipate more what kind of deterioration we might see in buildings where heating has been off for months and in some cases years, particularly where there's shared buildings like flats. And I'm sure there's no one here who hasn't seen their direct debit increase to hitherto unimagined levels in the past couple of years. But it's worth saying that as we approach winter 2023, we're doing it with what Ofgem describes as the highest level of consumer energy debt ever seen. £700 is the average household debt currently, and that rises to several thousands for many households. So another winter, with energy a tiny bit cheaper than it was last winter, but with no government help for the majority. So virtually everybody saw 60-something pounds come into their account every month. And that's not going to happen this year for the majority of households. And that's with energy prices at twice what they were 3 years ago. And so truly a grim slide. So we enter the reality of living in cold, damp homes with no ability to cook or heat water for a bath. If you can wash clothes, you almost certainly can't dry them. So life's harder for kids too, facing the challenges of school and the pressures of social normalcy within all of that. Dr. Alice Lee of Alderhay in Liverpool is a paediatric registrar who specialises in early intervention in respiratory health inequalities. And she was frank in her warning at our conference in March to say that we're looking at an increase in infant mortality now. So ladies and gentlemen, in Scotland in 2023, babies are going to die from the cold in their own homes. And to end, as our very recent programme for government showed, none of this is a priority for Scottish Government, already leading heavily into an election-focused manifesto. We need policy at the heart of our movement with a person-based approach for change. We need to prioritise the households most urgently in need of retrofitting. And as a sidebar, we need housing authorities to be allocating homes based on energy affordability too, for the particular needs or income of any particular household. We need to look at retrofitting in a whole country way, focusing resources at areas like the Western Isles, and stop with the empty rhetoric about what we'll do for communities who are harder to reach in winter, with all the economic and social challenges of decanting, of temporary and affordable accommodation, training workforce and maintaining new systems in remote and rural areas. We need to stop focusing on the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest to reach individuals, the easiest to reach houses. Because in June, savings in the UK were withdrawn at their highest level in decades. And so how will we support homeowners and private landlords to undertake retrofitting in this financial climate? Trading Standards, I spoke to somebody from Trading Standards in Glasgow last week, and they're talking about energy efficiency measures issues being the equivalents of the new Green Deal, actually, in terms of the numbers that they're seeing of complaints and the resources they're having to allocate to deal with this on a case-by-case basis. So it's buildings and it's net zero, but above all, it's human beings. And they're dying in Scotland. They're being taken to hospital in ambulances. The ambulance service said last winter is the highest rate of hypothermic incidents that they've ever seen since records began. And we really do know what the problems are, but we rely on everybody now to find the solutions and enact on them with some speed. Thank you.
It was an interesting topic to kind of to address, and it really is the kind of it's the golden thread, isn't it? How do you achieve environmental targets, but also with the eye on how that impacts on the people living in these spaces? So how do you tackle that social aspect of it. Back to this idea that, this idea of being able to knit these two things together, and in some ways actually it's three things, but we'll come to that in a minute. So I don't really have the solution. I have a solution, one that we're pursuing at Link Group, but there are many, many challenges when you add that social dimension into the mix. It's relatively easy to set a framework whereby you can demonstrate that you've met environmental targets, as long as nobody asks you to prove it, right? Don't do that. That bit where you're evaluating people actually using the building. As long as you don't do that bit, then it's all good. Obviously, clearly, we want to push for that type of evaluation after improvements, but that's a very difficult kind of thing to do. Just sort of turning to Link Group's kind of approach to this, there are three kind of themes, because I said there was two, but actually there's kind of a third one. The environment's a clear one, and social is another one. Environment is something that for a social housing provider, you're pretty much regulated for. So EISH, or the Energy Efficiency Standard for Social Housing. For the students in the room, by the way, you will be moving into a domain that is absolutely littered, right, with acronyms. EISH is one of them. TLAs, that's the three-letter acronym, you get there, you get the point. And so you spend a lot of your time just explaining what these bleeding acronyms are. But EISH is the thing that kind of drives social housing, so where do we want to be? And we're currently in a hiatus. We're currently sitting between what was EISH 1 and what will become EISH 2, and there hasn't been a firm decision made on what that is and how that's going to be focused. And much of the kind of policy break at the moment, when we dig into the sort of policy areas in this, centres around about the EPC. Now, Richard and I could probably have an entire day picking apart the value of the EPC on a kind of academic level. On a very, very practical level, it is the only information we have. So we're kind of devil. We don't. It's a difficult one to drop. There is obviously the reform of EPC, which is ongoing, and we are hopeful that within the context of that, there will be some light, or at least some common language brought into the frame, particularly around about how we bring other systems into the frame of this, and it's not always, it has to be an EPC, it has to be SAP, it has to be BREEDM. Maybe there's other kind of things out there that could do basically the same job, but it's just so far they've never talked the same language. So if we break that language barrier, maybe that's the best thing we can hope for. The other one I'm going to throw in there is governance. Any organisation out there, particularly in the social housing sphere, that ignores governance, it's for banks. The earlier chap talking about how banks are important in all of this. Banks are important in all this. They will finance. Ultimately, they will be the financiers of how we get out of this, or how we reach these solutions. So really, it's about kind of creating the environment where these banks are happy to give you money. ESG, ESG really is quite a big move within housing. It is how you unlock that type of finance. Now, mostly it's driving the new build sector, but we can see somewhere in the future how these kind of products might actually end up driving that retrofit sector, because there is that kind of virtuous circle that, as long as it's auditable, whereby a credit can be generated for the savings that you bring into that system. I've called this a decade of social housing. I probably should have started with that, but why a decade? Well, it's 2023, and we probably reckon at the moment that we've got till 2033 to meet whatever the heck EISH 2 will be. Right, so a lot of forecasting going on here. Just transition, I'm sure there's a phrase that you've heard before, and I think actually the just transition philosophy probably neatly brings those two first things in, that kind of social aspect, but also the environmental aspect. How do you achieve both? But how do you achieve both without denigrating one part of society? That's the kind of the golden thread on that. So very much just transition sits at the heart of the strategy that Link Group have adopted on this. We have an overriding principle, one that I'm wholeheartedly bought into, and I think, I'm going to guess that the majority of the room is also supportive of, which is that when you're looking at improving the energy performance, now whatever that is, right, energy performance doesn't mean it's anything. It means what you define it as. Right? So you have very different views depending on who you talk to when you say energy performance. An EPC is a measure of energy performance, but it's not the only one. There are different ways to measure one property next to another property. Lisa talked about bills. Your bill next to somebody else's bill, that's an energy performance. That's a measure. Right? So it's a metric of that. So when we are looking at improving energy performance, we would definitely look at improving the building fabric as the primary part to this. This is because, in reality, as a social housing provider, that's the thing that's the bricks and mortar, or timber and membrane, or whatever you like, right? So that's the thing that will be there for 50, 70 years, blah, 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 right? A heat pump will be replaced within 12 years, maybe 15, right? But in order to get that stretch, you will have had to have maintained it at a pretty high cost. And these revenue costs yearly, are a problem for social housing providers because rent, right? Anything that is a cost pressure on an annual basis is a rent pressure somewhere down the line. And so we have to kind of contend, and if we're sticking to this just transition thing, is it fair to give somebody the best eco-bling home money can buy, when in reality, in order to maintain that eco-bling over its lifespan, it costs a lot of money, which basically means it impacts on rent. So there's this kind of contention here about we are churning revenue into our environmental target. That's how we meet our environmental target, is basically pushing it down the line as an annual cost. Right? So there's this kind of contention thing. And then looking at the low and zero carbon kind of technologies that could be deployed into that property to achieve whatever amenity it is that we're serving. Lastly is really the on-site generation and storage, and it really is a kind of, I'm going to say, a philosophical contention. There is an aspect about this if we then bring sustainability into it, and material sustainability in particular. Is it right that we invest a lot of money in lithium-ion batteries? Throw that one out there. And if we look at the materials, rare earth metals and whatever that are put into the construction or manufacture of PV panels, again, there's another argument. And it isn't right to just kind of say, it's China's problem. It's a global issue. Retrofit strategy, time-wise, by the way. I meant to start my thing, we're okay, 5 minutes. In terms of strategy, we're looking at a kind of mass strategy. We're looking at, first defining, where we want to go with certain things on an archetype kind of basis. But then how do we then ramp that right up? How do we get the finance to push that through? How do we then do that on hundreds and thousands of properties, all up to the same specification? Knowledge is key. Understanding what is going on in your stock at any one point is key to that. And we're currently developing an internal kind of process to bring that knowledge into our systems, but then be able to act on that knowledge, be able to utilise that knowledge smartly. Some of it's EPC knowledge. Richard and I can, again, having a whole day about how we trust in the robust nature of the EPC information that we have on our fingertips, but I'll go leave that. In terms of, again, retrofitting, that's that fabric first approach that we would take. We would be looking at improving the actual building fabric, but also the ventilation of the building as well. These are the front-ended parts of this. Make the building, low energy requirement, make the building not drafty. And I did like Lisa's statement about, one of the things which is tackle drafts. Drafts make people do stupid stuff. There's a draft, turn the heating up. No, there's a draft, I better get those little strips of wood out and ram them into the floorboards for the next 3 months. So we are looking at improving our asset management data. And that's not just simply to be kind of pedantic about the information we hold. There is a purpose for this information, and we need to be able to utilise it. It's in planning. It's in then us being able to demonstrate the impact of what we do. That archetype approach will basically follow the kind of RD-SAP philosophy here. How do we get to an understanding of fabric performance? This is what the archetype is effectively deciding. Why an archetype approach? It's not an archetype probably as you would understand it as architects. It's an archetype. It's a common position. It's a common position across different construction types in reality. So, in one sense, you've got that kind of column there which talks about different types of wall construction. And then you've got another column that talks about age band. Who really cares about that, right? And then what type of property is, blah, blah, blah. In reality, all of this washes through to a presumed U value. That's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to this end point where we understand that that one is better than that one. That one is the one we need to tackle first, right? Now, we could argue that, okay, this is something that was this is an abstraction that was put into the RD-SAP process to give you that U value. You guys mostly don't really care about this, right? You calculate the U value, right? I'd love to be able to do that, right? And in the existing, calculate the U value, how would you do that? I can tell you exactly how you would do it, but very few people ever do. Very few people ever measure in situ U values. Yeah, it takes a couple of weeks, right? So this is the kind of rollout plan. We get that kind of information piece right. Number one, we must start off with truth, not presumption. A lot of presumptions in EPCs. So then we have to have that kind of believability scale. We have to have that idea that we trust that data, we don't trust that data. Thank you. Then we've got this developing our kind of archetype approach to that, so how we break up the rather large stock that Link Group has. And, that last one, which I kind of made a little bit of joke about earlier, really cycle back on that. How is that impacted on the people that live in these buildings? Because that then needs to come back around again, You need to kind of, is it working? Yes, good, let's do more of that. Is it working? No. Well, let's stop doing the thing that we think is working. Let's change it to something that does. Here's a radical new thinking approach. You actually review. What's a good target to aim for? I'm pretty sure you've probably seen LETI before. This is the LETI thing. This is one of the kind of things that's underpinning much of what we're pushing for. So somewhere between about 50 to 75, maybe. We haven't quite landed on an exact number there, but that would be a kind of healthy sort of target. How are we doing so far? This is some analysis using EPC data that we've carried out. And in actual fact, Link Group's entire stock, about 40% of it actually probably falls within that kind of good range. None of it's the 50. I mean, there's a small proportion of it there that is the 50. But if you're just going to look at the less than 100 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year, then actually we're in a good place. And that's actually more down to the mix of properties in Link Group. Mainly, it's a huge proportion of new builds in there. So that's why it kind of looks the shape it is. Or cost. We'll go back to cost because I like cost. What impact of cost does it have? This was another project that was carried out, I think it was last year. Parity Projects did a kind of review of current technology, and it turns out that actually fabric and heat pumps can provide you with savings, and here was the demonstration in order to show that. So fabric alone won't get you the net zero, but fabric is very foundational to achieving that success. And my last thing, Richard, is definitely a criticism of SAP. I'm afraid to say I couldn't do a presentation that was vaguely related to SAP and not throw this in here. We as, currently under EIS 1, we would get SAP 2012 to 70. Right? That would be the kind of aim, the target, anything over 70. This table is available, by the way, you don't need to take photos of it, it's in the SAP methodology. But if we were to take that property that we got to EIS 1, right, and we then put an electrical heating system in it, it would then drop to 57. This is the reason why you never get a heat pump being recommended on an EPC. This is a big policy problem for government in Scotland, government in England, is that it won't say put a heat pump in, because when you calculate it out, it makes it worse. Why? Because the electricity is more expensive. Ultimately, SAP is just an index of cost, like pounds and pence. Right, I'm done. I had to throw that in.
Hello. Although I'm a chartered building surveyor, I don't always admit it, and I didn't admit it when I inquired about getting some help for retrofitting my house in Orkney. And so I'm just going to tell you about what happened during that process. I don't know. The first stage was to get an energy assessment by Home Energy Scotland. I could give a talk about what happened then, but I don't have time to do that. The more interesting thing is that they referred me on to Warmworks, and they run the area-based scheme in Orkney, which is financed via the Orkney Islands Council, and that's them at the county show. They're a very friendly bunch, and you can see that they have lots of testimonials of happy, satisfied customers, including Mrs. L of Stromness, who got internal wall insulation. So someone from Warmworks phoned me up, and he said, I said, I don't think I qualify for anything. I'm self-employed, and I don't think I'm in fuel poverty. And he said, no, don't worry, everyone in Orkney is in fuel poverty. So I said, well, okay, I'll go along with this process and see what happens. So he came along to the house, and he took all my financial details and so on and so forth. And he said, you qualify for free internal wall insulation. And none of these people have a retrofit qualification. There's the next stage is the technical survey. So this is, I went onto the web and found how they'd got the contract in Orkney. The previous providers, Firefly Energy, went bust, and the Orkney Islands Council went out to tender again, and it was a £5 million contract over 5 years, and those are the figures of how much they can spend on each house. So I don't know what that figure includes, but basically they'd got £7,500, I can't read it there, to spend on my house. I went back to the Home Energy Scotland report, and even using their figures, which are just standardised figures, the cost of internal wall insulation came out at 11,200. So I was wondering how they would square that circle. First of all, I'll tell you something about my house. It's on a village street. It's sandstone, 1860s, pointed with cement, got various problems. You can see the splashing water up from the pavement, plastic windows, some of them seized shut because of the marine environment, no trickle vents, and a problem of damp getting through at the junction between the stone and the plastic. At the left, there's an old shop with a very drafty door and a single glazed window. So it's definitely Path C under past 2035. That's the back. There's a typical 1960s kitchen and bathroom extension. The bathroom is at the left-hand side. No insulation whatsoever when I stripped it out. No ventilation. And extremely cold. The kitchen does have a bit of insulation, but it's still extremely cold. And when we broke through into the old shop, we could see what the building is made of. You can see just there, the stone is laid in clay mortar. It was originally pointed up with lime. There's lots of built-in timbers, and that is a genuine ship's timber. I spend most of my time telling people they haven't got ship's timbers, but that is definitely a rib from a ship, and there was a shipyard, so 200 yards away in the 19th century. And you can see lime plaster on the inside. And this is, I could show you lots of photographs of the damp in the house, but this is just one of the window reveals. Plastic windows have been fitted into the sash boxes of the original sash windows. You've got lime plaster that's had emulsion paint over it, it's blistering, and you've got a damp problem that's very difficult to solve. So, the day of the technical survey arrived, and I expected some sort of retrofit assessor or someone like that to turn up. And what happened, there's a local building company who are a very reputable company who do good work, have got the contract to do the actual internal wall insulation. And the guy who turned up to do the technical survey was very friendly. But when I spoke to him and looked at his LinkedIn profile, it turned out that his career up till then had been in the sheet piling industry, that he'd come up to work on the new pier in Stromness and liked Orkney so much that he'd got the job of a contract manager with the building firm. And he'd worked for them for 6 months, and he was doing the technical assessment on my house. So far, the people I dealt with at Warmworks and the technical guy knew nothing about retrofit, which didn't inspire me with confidence. And yes, I've got my slide back. And he showed me what he was going to use. This is a Kingspan phenolic foam bonded to plasterboard, and he was going to put that on the inside walls. They also have, the Q-Bot has arrived in Orkney, and this is a robotic little cute thing that trundles about in the floor void and squirts a closed cell polyurethane foam onto the underside of your floors. And this got into the Orcadian newspapers, you know, the great thing that Warmworks had brought to Orkney. And my thought was, you know, what could possibly go wrong? Luckily, my floor void isn't deep enough to get the Q-Bot in, but we went round the house and he explained, no doing the flanking walls or the floor void or anything, take the shutters off. They use a thinner version of the Kingspan insulation on the reveals. Round the meters, no, they can't take the meters off, so they just leave the insulation off around the meters. Front door, not enough space to get the insulation in, so they just put plasterboard there. Internal doors, where there isn't, where they don't want to move the doorway, they just taper the board at the doors. And so on and so forth. Oh, that's the staircase. They can't do the staircase, but it would reduce the width, so they leave that out. The problem of the sort of cold and leaky bathroom and the cold kitchen, well, that's not a problem because they don't do it. They don't take any fittings off. So the coldest rooms in the house don't get any attention whatsoever. So I did, well, I'm not going to read through that, but basically I've written down the principles of retrofit, and yes, whole house approach, ventilation, heating, existing defects, moisture movement, vapor open insulation, great attention to detail to avoid cold bridges, preferably use natural insulation on solid stone walls with lime plaster, all completely ignored. And you know, if I'd allowed them to do that to my house, I mean, first of all, it would be ineffective. And secondly, they're storing up some pretty serious problems of damp and mold and possibly long-term rot in timbers. So I can't really square that with all the Warm Firm publicity. If you look at their YouTube channel, you find this sweet little old lady in Kirkwall saying, I can't brag about them enough. So what's going on? How can they do retrofit with no one in the process having any qualifications in retrofit, and then propose to do internal wall insulation that's going to be ineffective and damaging? So that's sorry to put a damper on proceedings, but that's my experience.